What's up guys, Lon here from Android Authority, and this is the Sony Xperia XA2 Ultra. And this is Sony's newest mid-range smartphone. It's arguably not quite as exciting as their upcoming flagship, the XZ2, but it's still worth taking a look at because it gives us a pretty good idea of what Sony is trying to do here in 2018 and the direction that they're headed. So I've been using this for the past week now, and I want to give you guys my thoughts on it. So let's get right into it. So I want to start with the design of the XA2 Ultra because I think that's where you're going to notice a pretty significant amount of changes. And when you're looking at this phone from a distance, you might not really notice anything. It still has that same boxy rectangular look as other Sony devices, but once you look a little bit closer, you will notice some differences here. So the first thing you might see is that the bezels are a lot smaller all the way around. You won't really notice it quite as much on the top and bottom because they're still kind of thick, but on the sides, they're practically non-existent, and the screen basically runs edge to edge now, so it sort of catches it up with the other designs that we're seeing on the market. It's completely made out of aluminum, so it has a really solid and sturdy feel to it, and it has some other really nice design touches as well, like the slightly curved back and the curved sides, and then the chamfered edges along the top and bottom to give it a more premium look. One thing I will say about the XA2 Ultra is that it definitely lives up to the Ultra name. This is a very big phone, and normally I don't really talk about the sizes of Android phones anymore because pretty much every Android phone out there is a big phone, and a lot of manufacturers have done a really nice job of making those big phones feel smaller by shrinking down the bezels and also switching to 18:9 screens. And the XA2 Ultra does do some of that, obviously, with the thinner bezels, but it still has a 16:9 display, so it still feels incredibly wide, and it's also really tall and really thick that it's a little bit uncomfortable to use in one hand. If you like big phones, you probably won't mind it, but for me, I'm just not a fan of how big this phone feels. Just in case you're wondering, the XA2 Ultra does have a headphone jack, so they are keeping that feature around for their mid-range lineup, but unfortunately, we can't say the same thing when it comes to their flagships. Now, the other big change here that you're going to notice is the placement of the fingerprint sensor. This used to be embedded in the side-mounted power button, but it now has been moved to the back underneath the camera. And I like this placement. It's very easy to reach with an index finger. It's nice and spacious, and it's also pretty fast at unlocking. And the best part about it now is that it finally works in the US. Thank you, Sony. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 16:9 display, and it measures in at 6 inches with a resolution of 1080p, and 1080p spread across a 6-inch screen isn't going to result in the sharpest looking panel, but it still looks great to my eyes. I can still comfortably read text and browse web pages, and it's also very vibrant, especially if you use the built-in super vivid mode, which really pumps up the color and contrast. And it is an IPS panel, but Sony has always done a really great job with their smartphone displays, and the XA2 Ultra is no exception. It has great viewing angles, and it also gets plenty bright that viewing it outdoors is not really an issue. On the inside, it's packing the Snapdragon 630 processor and 4 GB of RAM, which are pretty run-of-the-mill mid-range specs, but it's still plenty fast and responsive. I haven't had any issues with lag, and 4 GB of RAM is still plenty for a smooth multitasking experience. It's not going to give you the craziest benchmark numbers if you care about that sort of thing, but in terms of real-world use, I don't think there's really a whole lot to complain about. One of the biggest benefits to the Snapdragon 630 processor is the battery efficiency, and when you pair that with the massive 3,580 milliamp hour battery of the XA2 Ultra, you have a recipe for some really awesome battery life. And the battery life on the XA2 Ultra is fantastic. It easily gets me through 2 full days of heavy use and a consistent 6 hours of screen on time, sometimes even close to 7. So if you're a heavy user or a light user, you should have no problems getting through a full day on this phone. One of the more interesting features of the XA2 Ultra is actually the cameras, more specifically the front-facing cameras, because there's 2 of them. The main sensor is a 16 megapixel camera with optical image stabilization, which is going to help with low light and also help you take less blurry selfies if you have a shaky hand. The second camera is an 8 megapixel wide angle sensor that is going to make it a lot easier to fit more people into the frame or fit more of the background into the frame, but it's at the expense of slightly lower quality. Next to the 16 megapixel camera is what Sony calls a slow sync flash, and what this is supposed to do is properly illuminate your face and the background when you're taking a selfie, because normally what tends to happen when you use a flash on the front facing camera is that your face will be illuminated but the background remains completely dark, and this is supposed to solve that. And in everyday practice, it does work. You do get to see a lot more of the background, but you also see a lot more noise get introduced into the shot, so it really isn't quite as impressive as it seems. On the backside is a 23 megapixel camera with an aperture of f2.0, and it's capable of a maximum ISO level of 12,800, which is pretty high for a smartphone. But something that I thought was really weird is that you can't manually dial in that ISO level with Sony's manual mode. It's just something that happens automatically when you're in a really dark situation. Even then, you're not really gonna wanna shoot at those ISO levels anyways, because there's gonna be an incredible amount of noise, and at around 1000 ISO or higher, you can already see a lot of noise creeping into the shots. And low light shots in general are not really that great on this camera. They're very washed out when it comes to color, highlights are overexposed, and they're very muddy when it comes to detail. The camera does fare a lot better in well-lit or daylight situations, which is not really all that surprising. You're gonna get much better color reproduction and better sharpness, and I would say the camera's biggest weakness is its lack of dynamic range. It really crushes the shadows that you lose a lot of detail in those areas. And HDR mode does help out a lot with that, but I'm not a fan of how it's buried in the settings menu and it's only accessible in manual mode, which makes it feel a little bit cumbersome and unintuitive. Now, as far as the software goes, it's Android 8.0 Oreo with Sony's Xperia customizations on top. And I like Sony software because it keeps the experience pretty close to stock, but you do get some usual Sony customization like the Xperia theme engine and the PlayStation integration. And there are some other Sony pre-installed applications, but it's nothing that we haven't really seen before from previous Sony phones. Now, specific to the XA2 Ultra is a one-handed mode that lets you shrink the screen down and makes the phone easier to use in one hand. And it has some other nice additional UI tweaks like letting you shift the dialer to one side to make everything easier to reach. If you're looking to pick up an XA2 Ultra, it's available now as an unlocked GSM device, and you can find it through carriers like Best Buy and Amazon. And at the time of this video, it's actually a little bit cheaper on Amazon, but the normal price is $450. If this was a sub $400 smartphone, I would say this is a no-brainer purchase because it does have a lot of really good things going for it, and it's a pretty solid mid-range smartphone from Sony. It has a much more modern design, it has long-lasting battery life, and it has a fingerprint sensor that finally works in the US. But at $450, it puts it pretty close to budget flagship territory with phones like the OnePlus 5T and Honor View 10, which can be had for $50 more and arguably offer a better bang for the buck. So at $450, it's a little bit tough to recommend, and like many Sony phones that have come before it, the price of the XA2 Ultra is going to be its biggest downfall. So that pretty much wraps it up for this review, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. We definitely appreciate it. Subscribe to the channel, which is down below if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. And of course, check us out on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, Google+, all that good stuff will be linked down below. And of course, check the website as well for more in-depth coverage, AndroidAuthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.